Uh, Actually, I think it may take a couple of minutes for setting up this one. So the current session is the linguistics in the era of LLMs. It just come to my mind that, LTRC also playing a lot of role in IIIT, not only in the linguistic education, also in the value education, right? So these LLMs issues, you see that hallucination and something, right? So, and also I think LLMs or the neural networks are mainly motivated by the human brain, right? So you see, currently the issue is that, we feel that we are developed, or we are something, and at the other hand, we are missing the values. Maybe whether values are required or not is a debatable question. So I think similarly, LLMs also, maybe the values like linguists or something may be missing. Maybe we'll see what is the role of it. Okay, I think who will be the better moderator than Professor Sangal, right? He is also a accomplished linguist and also human activist. Over to him. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to invite Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya, Professor Deepti Mishra Sharma, and Dr. Manojit. And we have two other panelists online. And I'll be Professor Joseph Janabit at DFKI and Soumya at the Canadian National Research Center. So since we have a large panel and the time is short, I'll quickly give a brief introduction and then we can jump into the panel. So first, so the order, I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting. So first, Professor Joseph van Genebith is one of the scientific directors of the German Research Center for AI, DFKI, the well-known DFKI. He heads the Multilingual Language Technologies Lab in DFKI. He's also professor of translation-oriented language technologies at Saarland University, Germany. He was the founding director of the Center for Next Generation Localization, now called ADAPT. His degrees, I'm not mentioning everything, just briefly. His first degree is in electronic engineering and in English from Aachen, Germany. So it combines both, I suppose, language degree, language training, as well as computer science and electronics. The second speaker would be Professor Manojit Chaudhary, Professor of Natural Language Processing at Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence at Abu Dhabi. Prior to this, he was principal scientist at Microsoft Research India and Microsoft Turing. He is currently also professor of practice at Plaksha University and adjunct professor at IIIT Hyderabad. So he visits. His research interests lie in the intersection of NLP with social, cultural aspects of technology use and ethics in particular. Been working on multilingual and multicultural aspects of large language models and their use in low resource languages. He also chairs the Indian National Linguistics Olympiad and holds his education is in BTech and PhD degree in computer science from IIT Kharagpur. We have then Dr. Soumya. She's the NLP researcher at Digital Technologies Research Center at National Research Council, Canada. She's joining us online. And she has experience in building data science teams at Canadian Industry Setup and was also a faculty member in an American public university. She did her PhD from Germany, University of Tübingen, and is a proud alumnus of IIIT Hyderabad. Current research interests are information extraction, multilingual models, reproducibility, and evaluation. Then we have Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya, already introduced earlier also, Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Bombay, and he served as Director of IIT Patna, and he also served as the President of the ACL, as a Fellow of the National Academy of Engineering, Abdul Kalam National Fellow, serves as editor for Journal of Natural Language Engineering and AII's AI magazine. Published over 350 papers, supervised more than 300 students at all levels. And I'll skip the rest. I'll go to Professor Deepti Sharma, Professor Emeritus and LTRC, IIIT Hyderabad, active member. She has made significant contributions to linguistics, language technologies, computational translation systems, etc. Earlier, before IIIT, she was at University of Hyderabad, and she's contributed to major projects, IL, Indian language to Indian language machine translation, dependency tree bank, development of dependency tree bank in Hindi and Urdu. She holds PhD in linguistics. So I think we'll jump straight with the panelists, and I request Professor Joseph to, so what we have done is we have 4 minutes each for the panelists. And after that, 10 minutes for any cross questions or issues that have arisen. And then we have last 10 minutes for the audience. This is what we have planned, but let's see. It's a little tight. So Professor Joseph. Yeah, kindly go ahead. Can't hear you, Joseph. Yeah, still not able to hear anything.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now.
Okay, very excellent. At the moment I can't hear you, but I guess we'll just make the best. So first of all, I would like to say heartfelt congratulations to this momentous event, the 25th anniversary of your institution. It's an amazing achievement. The impact you had in India, but also on a truly international stage. It's amazingly impressive. Congratulations to that. And I'm very much looking forward to the next 25 years. I'm not sure I'll be at the next celebration, but it'll be amazing to see what our younger colleagues will have done by then, I'm quite sure. So let me say a few things about linguistics and large language models. Natural language processing, it's probably fair to say, is a young science. It's sort of like, I don't know, maybe 60 years old, 70 years old. And it's very typical of young scientists to rapidly undergo paradigm shifts. And we had a couple of those paradigm shifts in natural language processing and computational linguistics. Those sort of like rule-based approaches that were inspired closely by linguistics. Then we had approaches that were based on statistical estimation. Then we had classical machine learning. And now we are, of course, in the age with amazing successes of deep learning and large neural networks and large language models, etc. actually, at the very, very beginning, taking a slightly historical perspective, at the very, very beginning, and here I mean the 1950s and early 1960s, there was not that much linguistics in natural language processing. And the results were not always very impressive. And there's a famous report, mostly focusing on machine translation, but not just on machine translation. It's called the ALPAC report. And I think it was issued in 1966, where a committee, I think they're called Automatic Language Processing Advisory Committee in the US, looked at the advances in machine translation in the mid-1960s, and they were not very impressed. And what they came up with is a diagnosis, and they said, like, actually, the way you're trying to do machine translation is a little bit naive, and it doesn't contain enough linguistics, and actually, we don't even know enough about languages yet. So they recommended to do computational linguistics, so like, study languages and linguistics, but also doing computational approaches. And in some sense, that is maybe the birthplace, or one of the birthplaces of this close intertwining between linguistics and natural language processing and computational linguistics. And I think that gave rise to an amazing flurry of new results and systems, and it still continues today to some extent, and I think for good reason, for very good reason actually. But it also hit a wall. And the wall is very often to do with the fact that natural languages are just so amazingly complex. One word, many meanings. One meaning, many words. Metaphorical languages, context dependence, etc. And that's just really, really hard to capture with rules. And if you try to do this, and you try to do this at scale, you end up with so many rules that you kind of like, it's very hard not to create a Frankenstein, because it's so complex that it's almost impossible to sort of like rule in some sense. And of course, at around the same time, there were alternative approaches such as like, the statistical estimation, like at IBM for acoustic speech recognition, but also machine translation. Then a bit later, then classical machine learning, now deep learning. And actually, some of the ideas, like looking at words and text as vectors, are actually quite old, because they're really old hat in information extraction, information retrieval. Like, of course, like to people working in information extraction, information retrieval, words were vectors, or words are vectors, and documents are vectors, like TF, IDF, for example. So, I think, in terms of scaling, in terms of amazing systems at industry scale, I think the direction is clear. I think neural networks, deep learning are just really, really amazing. They have lots of problems, but there's lots of research on that as well, on trying to address these problems. But at the end of the day, I think my take would be that whatever's going to happen in the future, linguistics is important, and it's super, super important as a language and a conceptual system, as Rajiv always emphasizes. Linguistics as a language for talking about language. And that's really, really important. Also for our engineers that, are very, very well versed in the latest methods in deep learning and machine learning, etc. It's really important to have a language to talk about the object of your science. And I think I think that's sort of like where linguistics will remain, like even in this age of deep learning. But it goes beyond that, because of course there's still very many open research questions in languages. There's no single language that is sort of like completely covered by linguistics, and there are interesting research fields where you have a pairing between deep learning and linguistics. So, for example, there's evidence that activations in large language models actually correlate to brain activations, and I think that's really interesting research. And I think with that, I think I've well covered my 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and I'm looking forward to my fellow speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. So we now go to Monojit.
Okay, so I will pick where Joseph left at that linguistics provides a language to talk about language, and why this is so important. No matter what you do with languages, be it deep learning, be it amazing systems, you always need that language. This comes at two places, I think, prominently. One is when we define our tasks. What task to solve. And you might think, okay, some of the tasks linguists had defined earlier, like post tagging, morphological analysis, parsing, are no longer relevant. And whether we agree or not is a different question. But even if I agree that they are no longer relevant, imagine the tasks that we are defining today. You know, NLI, glue. If you take the glue, super glue benchmark on which, or MMLU, these are all linguistic tasks. And not considering linguistics in these tasks actually create a confusion. And I will give you one example. So once you define the task, you also need to evaluate the models. And that evaluation process also, I think, requires linguistics, because unless you have the language to describe the qualities of the sentences that you are processing, you miss a lot of things. I'll give you one example. So we were working on natural language inferencing. And those who have worked with NLI and used NLI datasets know or would have observed that it's a mixed bag. You know, I mean, you have a hypothesis, you have a premise, and the relationship between the hypothesis and premise, whether it entails or not, could be because of various reasons. It could be a logical entailment. It could be a temporal entailment. It could be a spatial entailment. And linguistics provides very neat framework to. It could be an implicature. It could be a presupposition, and there are great frameworks, but nobody has used them. It's a mixed bag. So we started classifying NLI examples by their linguistic, categories. We call it taxi NLI, a taxonomy for NLI. The data set is out there. But the interesting observation was we saw that Swahili had very low scores overall. And the point was why Swahili, out of all 7-8 languages we looked at, including Hindi, which is low resource, did not have that low score on the task while Swahili had. And once we looked at different classes, it was not that Swahili was low consistently across all the classes. It was one particular class, which was when negation was important to understand, do the logical processing. So further logical would be negation and or, right? These are the three logical things. So negation. And then when we looked at the data, what happens in Swahili in negation is you add there is no single word like not for negation. Right, in Hindi we have nahi, mat. In all these other languages we had particles for negation. Swahili didn't. What Swahili had was a morpheme which connected to the verb, and that morpheme changed with the subject and tense. Now what happens is when your tokenizer gets it wrong, you can never get negation. Now that whole story I told you, just think of how many linguistic terms I used. And I would not be able to tell you that story and give you that insight and analysis if I did not consider linguistics. So I think that's the crucial role when it comes to, let's say, evaluating and getting deeper insights on where a model is working and where it isn't. And while structural linguistics is important, but I think the models today are so smart that we can go much more beyond, and we can look into pragmatics. We can look into sociolinguistics and those kind of explanations, which opens up whole new areas of research, I think. And the reverse is also true. We can now use generative AI to study, let's say, model sociolinguistics at scale and so on. So it's both ways. Not only linguistics help generative AI can also help linguistics. And I think it's very, very needed. Let me stop here.
Thank you. So we'll now go to Soumya. And perhaps Soumya will tell us what is important, linguistics and or not.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, congratulations, LTRC. Congratulations to all of us for the celebration. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel. And thank you for Joseph, Professor Joseph and Professor Monojit for their insights on the role of linguistics in the era of LLMs today. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective because a good discussion needs all perspectives and say maybe we don't need as much linguistics today. I have mainly two things to say. So the first thing is domain expertise. So we are seeing large language models in many places beyond NLP, beyond traditional NLP tasks. So just yesterday there was a panel discussion on multimodal models in this event. So it's not just about language anymore. And even in terms of end user applications where large language models are being used or where NLP is going, it's going into many different disciplines, and there are many different applications coming up, real world applications. So at that point, then the next question is, what do we really need beyond the technology? Is it domain expertise or is it linguistics expertise? Linguistics itself can be the domain in some cases. Like say, for example, I'm building a grammar checker or something like that, and knowledge of grammar of a language, that itself is the domain expertise in that particular case. But let us say I'm developing some NLP application for some finance or something like that. Traditionally, when we think of where do linguists come into picture when we are developing NLP systems, we think of data annotation, labeling, and coming up with evaluation sets, evaluation strategies, doing qualitative analysis, and these kind of things. So all these things, when you're looking at a specific domain, needs, in my view, needs more of a domain expertise than specific linguistic expertise. So, and if you look at the problems with LLMs, like say with bias in models or hallucinations or things like that, these problems are not just technical or linguistic in nature. So there is potential socio-technical, socio-cultural angle to it. So like Professor Joseph and Professor Manoj said, linguistics probably helps us in describing what the problem is, because it's a language about talk about language, but maybe it does not offer clear solutions for these kind of problems. So what I want to say essentially is maybe we need a different form of linguistics, probably not the kind of linguistics that we've been using in NLP, like say, for example, things like say part of speech tagging, constituency parsing, dependency parsing. Maybe that's not the kind of linguistics we need for LLMs. Maybe it is some other form. And finally, like Monojit also said, linguistics also may need some large language models today. Like in even EMNLP last month, there were some papers on using LLMs for glossing endangered languages. When you talk about glossing endangered languages, you think about field linguists, talking to people, documenting the languages, and so on. But here now we are talking about using large language models to gloss endangered languages, even though we don't know, whether the large language model already saw this language or something like that. Because at a higher level, you can think of large language models as being able to learn some kind of relationship between symbols, if not specifically language. So yeah, so that's essentially what my stance is. Maybe we need domain expertise more than linguistics, and maybe we need some other new parts of linguistics than what we've been traditionally using for NLP. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Soumya. I look forward to discussions on each of these points as we go along. I request now Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya.
Okay, I'm going to make a few remarks which are actually borrowed from the NLP course that I teach. So some of the things I say there, and I think they're relevant here, is that linguists are also actually data scientists. They discover patterns, regularities from language data. Now, I have seen the history of Paninian morphology, and have come to know that Panini used to move, over villages, towns, and so on, listening to what people are saying. And then Ramo, Rama, okay, where the lexeme is Ram, and the Subant, okay, the Pratipadik coming and attaching with Ram. So these generalization of Subant, Tingant, etc. for verbal forms, they came from observation of lots of linguistic data. Okay, so I would like to call linguists also as data scientists, and linguistics is a kind of data science. Now, if we look at natural language processing, this also I tell my students that there are two pillars on which NLP rests. One is linguistics, the other is probability. One is language science, the other is data science. Now, linguistics, as has been said before by my co-panelists, linguistics comes at the stage of preparing data for training in models. So part of speech tagging, for example, is a task where annotated data is required. Now, designing part of speech tags is a very intricate exercise where both linguistic insight and computational insight are needed. If the part of speech tag set is very coarse, it is not useful in the downstream NLP application. If it is too fine grain, then the classification accuracy is very low. Again, it not being useful in the downstream applications. And where is probability used? Probability linguistics is used in interpretation of results. I have an experience similar to Manojit's. When we started building statistical machine translation systems in 2010, 11, 12, that period, we found that Dravidian languages, it was Anup's work actually, Dravidian languages show very low accuracy in the n by n blue score matrix. Dravidian languages show low accuracy. And we understood that this is because Dravidian words are extremely agglutinated. And unless you segment and bring the morphemes and establish alignment mappings for them, the accuracy is bound to be low. So this comes from the linguistic insight of how the Dravidian morphology behaves. Now, coming to probability, one of the key foundations of a deep learning system is the softmax function, which shows that a neural network can compute probability. And that probability distribution is compared with through the cross entropy loss function with the target distribution. And that is our bread and butter. So the other very important point is that whatever with the underlying distribution, if you have a sufficient amount of data, then central limit theorem says that we can make use of normal distribution approximation, whatever with the underlying distribution. So these are extremely powerful conceptual instruments which give us theoretical tools to move forward. And finally, we see what is our bread and butter as a researcher. We understand language phenomena and then use mathematical tools to create a model out of it. We are empowered by the fact that neural networks can be universal function approximators. So this the mathematical model is now cast into the neural network, which is a universal function approximator. We bring the results, we do analysis, compare with baseline, and write the paper that is an advancement on the field. So this is our bread and butter. This actually happens. Okay, the blind feeding of data into a machine learning model, obtaining the results, is not really common, even if we would like to think about it. Yesterday, there was a beautiful talk by Dr. Srinivas, Journey of NLP from Glass Box to Black Box. Okay, he touched upon many of these very insightful points. So my point is that we need a balance of language science and data science, in particular linguistics and probability, giving lots of importance to both. And the final point is that linguistics is needed not for the machines. Linguistics is needed for NLP researchers. We get our insight, inspiration, energy from linguistic insight. This gives us a kick. And therefore, we take up interesting problems and do NLP. If large language models want to do NLP research, they may not need linguistics, but we human beings need.
I'll request now Professor Deepti Sharma to.
So I'll start with an example. Very recently, one of my students gave me his thesis draft to review. When I started reading the first para, I found it, I was very impressed and I said, wow, this guy knows his English. Second para, some doubt set in. And I thought, is it his English? And third para, I was quite confident that this is ChatGPT. I called him and he said, yes, ma'am, only for introduction. Because I tell my students not to use ChatGPT for a reason. I don't want to get into it, but a very well-founded reason. So I obviously I sent him back. I said, write it yourself. What it left me with was, I mean, how come I was able to identify that this was not written by a human being? English was beautiful, very fluent, ideas were presented well, but there was some element in the entire thing which made me identify that this is not written by a human being. So this needs closer study before one can come to some conclusions, and linguistics is needed to actually identify what is happening there. Now I'll bring in another aspect. When Chomsky came on appeared on linguistic scene, he came up with new proposals and ideas which were really quite, one would say, even revolutionary when people were studying the way people were studying linguistics. Amongst his many ideas, there were some two or three very core ideas. One was competence, performance. I just want to talk about these. Now, competence, according to Chomsky, was the knowledge that a speaker of a language has. The knowledge using which the speaker of a language can then form sentences. And Chomsky, by the way, was only looking at the structural aspect of language. And performance is the other aspect. And performance is use of language. And Chomsky was not interested in performance. Why? Because performance had noise. He didn't say noise, but noise in the sense that they were unstructured sentences. They were not, there may be disfluencies, and there was variability. Variations were there. So all that was distracting from looking at language from the point of view when you're looking at its mental process. So Chomsky put performance aside and focused on competence. Chomskyan research gave a certain direction to research in linguistics at that point, and which has remained. But there was, and was well accepted, but there was a section of linguists, anthropologists in fact, who were looking at the language of certain communities very closely. And these anthropologists, linguists, were not disagreed with Chomsky. And they said, well, you cannot put performance aside, because performance is an important component. So Chomsky was not looking at language as an instrument of communication. Chomsky was looking at language, I mean, and it's a very interesting aspect of language, the way it is working in our mind, the psychological aspect. Whereas the people who are working with the language of the people in a society are looking at language as a means of communication. And for them, performance was an important part. But they didn't say performance, they said, you cannot stick to the competence of the type that Chomsky was talking about. And Delheims, one of these scholars, came up with the idea of communicative competence. Now, communicative competence talks about, or rather, when you start looking at language in use, there are aspects of language, and at this point, I'll say there are intra-language aspects and there are extra-language aspects. Intra-language are that we are talking about structural aspect of it. So you can talk of pure stacking and the way sentences are framed or whatever information is there within the language itself. But when language is being used and a human being is using it, there are aspects of language. And for this group, the social linguists, variation was very important. They said variation is integral to language. And therefore, you cannot put variation aside. You have to look at it. Now, what does variation do? This gives choices. And a human being uses these choices consciously. And then what becomes important is what is being spoken, where, to whom, and when. Now, this is the extra part, and this is equally important. And I'll just, we can take it up later because all the points that others made are important. So what Soumya said, and I think Monojit also said, that structural part may not be important anymore when we are doing the kind of NLP we are doing today, but there are aspects which are still unexplored and which need to be incorporated when we are talking of conversational. And I'll just take use an example from my life. I was 14, 15 years old, and a cousin who was much older than me was visiting us. And I have to apologize to Joseph because I'm going to use a Hindi example, but I hope my tone will tell you something. So he was much older to me, was visiting, and my brother was just 1 year old, and another brother who was 4 years older to me, and this cousin were sitting in a room and chatting. It was dinner time. My mother sent me to call them for dinner. So I entered the room and I said, Kukku Dadda, and Dadda is the term we use for addressing the elder brother. So I said, Kukku Dadda, khana khane chaliye. Arun Dadda, khana khane chalo. Pappu Dadda, chalo khana khane. Same vocabulary, more or less. Same syntax. Now it had a lot of other information in it. The relationship, my relationship with each one of them, and lots more. So these are the aspects of language which are still unexplored and have to be incorporated in language if we want to do NLP for use as human beings use it. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I think lots of interesting questions have come. But let me start from, what Joseph said. And he talked about how historically, how things happened in NLP. And initially, the LPAC report, which actually killed all funding for machine translation, that was its impact in America and then followed in Europe and Russia. It said, no, you should study language. And in a way, he said computational linguistics developed because of that. But as these grammars were being written for use by computers, they were clearly inadequate. The existing theoretical grammars which existed could not be used directly, and so on. So at some point, statistical NLP came in. But statistical NLP maintained, there was scope for maintaining the linguistic divisions, if you will, in linguistics knowledge, if you will, in morphology, in phrasing or chunking, followed by dependency, analysis, and so on. In artificial neural networks, all that is gone. So what do you say about that? That this change that occurred, so statistics and linguistics actually married each other, contributed to each other, and gave birth to many interesting systems. And then came ANN, they said, no, we don't need any marriage, we'll do alone. So what would you say? Yeah, to you, Joseph.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Again,
I think
sound
the
is low.
sort of like I don't know whether you can call it a divorce, because you used the marriage metaphor, which I think is really nice, But I think the sort of like the divorce between statistical and methods and linguistics happened already to some extent in ASR and in statistical machine translation, because the notion of a phrase, for example, in statistical machine translation is not the same as the linguistic notion of a phrase. It's just a contiguous sequence of symbols that is matched to another contiguous sequence of symbols in the target language using alignment probabilities, kind of like, And I think in early statistical machine translation, there was quite a bit of discussion and also criticism, because from a more traditional linguistic background, people were asking why don't you use phrases or chunks, sort of like linguistically motivated chunks, like, I don't know, prepositional phrases and noun phrases and verb clusters or something like that. And some of the early papers in statistical machine translation tried to answer that question. So there's one by I can't remember the Philip Kuhn, I think, is one of the co-authors, where they actually chunked the training data, the bytext training data, using linguistic information. I think that they used the chunking method, where they in the languages that they looked at, they looked at the function words. So every time you had a preposition or a determiner, you have some indication that maybe sort of like a noun chunk is starting. When there's a preposition, maybe you have some information that a prepositional chunk is starting or something like this. And then they restricted the phrase extraction for that statistical machine translation system to the linguistically motivated phrases, and they found that the results go down, because you don't capture this sort of like really crazy variability. So I think already in that work, there's sort of like, some divergence between linguistic ideas and more purely statistically motivated ideas.
Okay. So I want to jump to this other aspect of domain expertise, domain knowledge versus linguistics based knowledge. Now, linguistics gives you a structure that would be very general, and indeed that generality can be useful. And Professor Pushpak mentioned about, what is the structure of, for example, he gave the example of part of speech set, tag set. It should not be too fine and it should not be too coarse. So the domain knowledge should not be too fine and not too coarse. What would you say if linguistics is already giving you a level which is not too fine, and hopefully it is not too coarse? But when you go to structure, dependency, relations, it's already giving you a structure which is not too fine. So what would you say about that? Soumya.
Yes. I probably want to give a more real world example that I encountered recently, where, I mean, I was in this project where we were doing text classification, which probably is like considered the most straightforward way of doing it. And with LLMs, there is no linguistics involved, tons of domain knowledge involved, because coming up with the label definitions and categories and then refining them, like, do we need 5 labels or 50 labels? If it is 50, we tried to do something and then we realized and reached like 20 or something like that. So a lot of back and forth happened, and all this was done with domain experts in that field. There was, as far as I know, nobody has a linguistics background, but all of them have a lot of knowledge about their own domain and about how this kind of fine-grained versus coarse-grained categorization comes for that particular problem. So that is what I mean when I say, maybe it is domain expertise, because traditionally when we think about the marriage between NLP and linguistics, we think more from a from academic tasks, right? But today we are no longer limited to academics or research, and we are using all these things in a wide range of application scenarios, which is why I think maybe domain knowledge can also be fine or coarse-grained and can be adapted to the problem.
So this is on this issue, because it was said by more than one of our panelists, that perhaps structures are not needed. Dependency or whatever other structures are not needed in linguistics. And you said, no, now we need domain knowledge. So what I'm trying to posit is that if you have used linguistic structures, the right structures like dependency, they are your first level of domain knowledge. So Monojit, you would like to say something on this?
Yeah, you are definitely right. I think that any when you are trying to study or model any domain, you need some sort of categories. And the moment you start talking about categories and their relationships, you are back to linguistics in some sense. And again, to give an example, very similar to Soumya's, so we talk a lot about reasoning these days. LLMs can't do reasoning, etc., etc. But the question is, what is reasoning, for instance? So we are trying to build, let's say we are trying to build an LLM that can do financial reasoning. It's a real story. We had this debate. We have been having this debate, actually. So the question is, what does you expect the LLM to do? That is fine. We know that we want this LLM to compute my tax, for instance. We want this LLM to advise me on which stocks to purchase. So the applications are clear, and that comes from my practical sense of the world, business value, etc. But the point is, tax, if you think of, it depends on the tax laws, which vary by country, vary by year. I don't want the LLM weights to have that information. That should be provided separately. Then what do you want the LLM to know? And it's a very hard question, because then if I think of a chartered accountancy paper, is it that you want an LLM to pass that exam? But does that actually mean that your LLM knows the thing? So then we are back to, okay, LLM should know compound interest, simple interest, maybe what is a stock, what is what is tax, what is income tax, different kinds of tax.
What is a loan?
What is a loan? So maybe it should know those relationship between those, and everything else can be provided as a separate outside information. So this is exactly what sort of is a dependency structure that you are talking about.
Yeah.
And I think since we don't have these structures at the moment, people have ontologies, but I agree with Soumya there that the way to look at things with LLMs and without LLMs might be different. And once you start building those structures, I think we will have a lot of handle over how to build agents, for instance, because we are struggling with it now and people are doing, just common sense.
So the argument that was made about structures, so phrase structure for the entire sentence may be less useful compared to dependency structure. And Panini actually worked with dependency. He gave the, Vishesha Visheshan Bhav, modified, exactly the dependency structures. So linguistics provides you the first layer of domain knowledge, if I use that word, but it's not domain specific, it is general. But let's shift topic now. So structural linguistics gives you that domain knowledge. That's what the point I was trying to make. But the other important points which have come, that language is not only about individual sentences and their structures. Language is about, beautiful example of honorificity. Khana khale, aap khana khaiye. So and two different ways of saying, and when you talk about connected discourse, across sentences, then there is an element of reasoning also comes. So would you think, this question to Professor Pushpak, do you think that by doing so, by introducing sociolinguistics, honorificity, etc., would that be very important if we want our even generative, I'm not talking of translation anymore, just generative models, to generate text which is coherent, which is meaningful, which makes easy to understand, the reasoning is clear. Coherence means that the reader can follow what the line of reasoning is in a way. So what role do you see of these theories of sociolinguistics, honorificity, discourse, grammars, and so on?
Right. So I'll come to this point very quickly. But before that, I want to draw your attention to one important point. So this layer of lexicon, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. Okay. this Montego semantics was a very powerful, though limited framework where it said that you can compositionally build semantics out of syntactic trees. Compose the meanings of subtrees, and then the composition of and then the whole meaning of the structure will emerge from that. But then it was found that, as Deeptiji pointed out, there are things beyond these syntactic structure, compositional semantics, and there come these phenomena of implicature, deixis, then presupposition, okay, information order. Why is it that you can say the flower vase is on the table, but you can't say the table is under the flower vase? Okay, so this is the information structure. All these are pragmatic phenomena, and they are beyond syntax semantics. Now, one of the most practical applications of pragmatics in action is chatbot, really. So, which is where theory and practice are very, beautifully blended. Now, we have a paper in this year's ACL where we wanted to investigate the pragmatic capabilities of large language models. And we studied this phenomena of deixis, preposition, implicature, etc. And we found how powerful these LLMs are and where do they stand with respect to human performance. Now, the point I want to make here is that when we ask these top level questions, what are the pragmatic capabilities of large language models? Then we recognize the presence of pragmatic phenomena. Then we are helped by the linguistic work of what are the different kinds of pragmatic phenomena, and how are these pragmatic phenomena handled by large language models. So my favorite slogan is linguistics is the eye and computation is the body. Without these question being asked and then understanding the categories of pragmatics, we could not have embarked on this task of investigating the pragmatic capabilities of large language models. So I would like to say that, to answer this question, all these phenomena are very important to be understood and modeled and then implemented and investigated for their results.
So, pragmatics relates to the intention of the speaker, what the speaker wants to do through language utterance, language as an action, the famous thing. Now, intentions, if you also bring in intentions now, so structure, social linguistics and intention, that is language. So it's very much a part of language and linguistics. So therefore, if you are going up to intentions, it's all the more important that you should bring in linguistics. You want to comment on this, Deepti?
Yeah, so one comment is, it looks like the entire panel, except Soumya, to a certain extent, not fully, disagree. But the entire panel seems to be fighting for linguistics. So that is important. I would say, see, pragmatics is important, and that's if we look at language in the way where we say there are these layers, and then pragmatics is naturally the next layer. It is important, I would say. But I was talking about this when I brought in social linguistics example. I was talking of another aspect of language where there are choices before the speaker, and the speaker is making one choice in any given context, and those choices are expressions of not just what the linguistic content of the utterance is, but expression of her social identity, her assertion as a social entity, her assertion of relationship with the person she is speaking, her own maybe certain kind of political opinions. All that comes through language, where you are not explicitly mentioning it, you are not lexicalizing it, but it is there. So that aspect, I feel, it's very challenging, but that is one aspect of language which you cannot leave behind or aside and talk of modeling language.
So I know this field is very big, So should we take up some questions now from the audience? Yes. Professor Uma Maheshwar Rao.
Okay, this need not be in the form of a question, right? It's a kind of comment. What I have heard about the speakers now proposed before this audience. Actually, in my opinion, NLP is linguistics. It is not actually technology. Technology is built behind it, and then that is used to process language. Processing language is part of linguistics. And then developing language technology tools is again actually a process of developing tools. So in between, whatever you are using, you are actually simulating language. Simulation of language is actually part of linguistics. And like Chomsky, etc., they are actually trying to build models of language in the mind. Whereas in the performance model in the society, people are building actually how this can be modeled out when the communication is actually going on. Now, between these two, actually, I can give you a kind of metaphor. All life forms move by locomotion. All life forms move by locomotion. Now, for that, they use different kinds of locomotive organs. Let us say human beings, they use legs. And now, they can walk, they can run. And also at times, if they need and there is a demand, they take different types of vehicles. And the building these vehicles to perform the same thing, like a simulation of locomotion of life forms, achieving the end result is actually moving from place to place. And this movement is again a locomotion of life forms. So activity and language is an activity, as you have said.
Speech
right?
acts.
And now that is actually done through the technology is being built. But what is done here is actually simulating the activity. So this is linguistics. NLP is actually essentially linguistics. There's no difference between the two. Yeah, that's my.
Okay. Yeah. Parmeshwari. Dr. Parmeshwari. Yeah. And after that, Bapi Raju.
Thank you. So both the fields, especially linguistics and NLP, have grown with data. Data is the centric for both either language analysis or generation here. And both the fields have evolved over a period of time. But at one point, linguistics have been stagnant because the theories and models that are being built are limited. Let's say a post-Chomskyan era, the kind of linguistics theories that are come up are like, handful, not many. But on the other hand, in the field of NLP, it has grown into different stages. Now, what do you think? What are the limitations and biases with the current linguistic theories? Like whether LLM can leverage the linguistic research in the future? If so, in what are the other ways?
So, any of the panelists?
I'm not sure that I will give you a very correct answer, but linguistic theory, in fact, post-Chomsky continued to grow quite a bit, okay? There is neurolinguistics, there is cognitive linguistics, there is psycholinguistics came post-Chomsky, and sociolinguistics as a field actually developed post-Chomsky. So post-Chomsky, a lot of linguistic theories have come, and I'm not covering them all. And cognitive linguistics is one that actually happened as a reaction to some of Chomsky's claims. And that's a field of research that one needs to probably look in, and people are already, I'm sure, looking. All those who are doing NLP and cognitive linguists are coming together to look at it. Yeah. That's what
Joseph,
I feel.
I just wanted to make another quick point about the data part that you mentioned. That's very true. Both the fields depend on data. And one of the limitations of linguistics is because humans look at the data. You cannot, if you don't go to quantitative or computational linguistics, then you cannot really study large-scale data.
I know.
So if you look at sociolinguistics literature, like when we were looking at code mixing, for instance, there are very limited studies, maybe with 10 participants here and 5 participants there. But with computational, power, you can do these studies at a much, much larger scale and come up with very interesting generalized theory. And very quickly, one example about honorifics. So recently we did a study of how in Wikipedia, in Hindi and Bengali, personalities are referred to. When is up used and when is up not used. And interestingly, in Hindi, there is a strong sentiment-based division. Like you use up when there is a positive or neutral sentiment, but not up when there is a negative sentiment, like terrorists, right? Articles on them will not use up. Bengali doesn't show that pattern. You use up for everybody except for children. So those linguists have never documented, and now we can do that.
Yeah, that's a good point, that we can use these tools to do further linguistics. Now, Professor Joseph wanted to say something.
Yeah, maybe I think maybe linguistics and data-driven approaches need each other, because if you just look at language data, there's a phenomenon that is referred to as reporting bias. So the way we use language is for communication, and of course we do not communicate what everybody knows. Okay, so if you try to learn, for example, event descriptions from large data sets, like, in the old days of AI, these were called scripts or something like this. Somebody goes into the restaurant, they sit down, they order a meal, they enjoy the meal, they pay, they give a tip, they go out or something like this. If you actually look at large data sets describing this, a lot of the stuff is just not mentioned, because we don't use language. I mean, this is like, if we used language to just communicate what everybody knows, somebody would call the ambulance and they would come with and say, "Sir, please come with us. You need to relax a little bit." Or we sometimes violate that sort of like communicative function of language, which is really focusing on the new and a little bit of what is known. We violate that consciously for jokes or for stories or something like this. And so I think in that sense, I think there is a point where, of course, like, in data science and in large language models, you train on massive amounts of data. But that data itself is also not neutral. It doesn't always tell you the full story. So I guess even there you have a fruitful, a fruitful basis for some kind of a marriage.
Yeah, we lost the sound. We lost the sound, Joseph. Yeah. Acha, he stopped. Okay. Professor Bapi Raju.
Yeah, actually, I think panel has addressed just now. I was going to say, if we have enough amount of experiential data that's collected, do we see this pragmatics, all these problems that have been traditionally posed by linguists and various other pragmatics is hard, all of this would vanish? I was going to ask Professor Pushpak. Going to vanish. No, these are phenomena. Phenomena will not vanish. So, so I would like to say that linguistics is required for benchmarking the LLMs. That is the point. So there are linguistic phenomena, and they have been documented over millennia. Now test the LLMs against those benchmarks.
So I have a question. So you think linguistics is not needed for building NLP systems, only for evaluation?
When the resource is in short supply, then we'll need linguistic signals on the data so that the models can still be trained.
But otherwise they are not needed.
Maybe not, yeah.
Yeah, please.
What about social linguistic aspect? Your data, currently the data and models trained on that, and the way you are training the models, will they be able to do this kind of things? I mean, make choices, conscious choices in certain contexts of certain options.
So let's take one particular phenomenon. Shall we say politeness is a phenomenon? Very simple, yes. Politeness, but seems like a very difficult proposition to implement. on on language models and so on. So there are different manifestations of politeness, lots of ramifications of politeness. Do we capture all of them? Who is asking this question? Somebody who is, isn't it? Who is asking this question? And when will such an entity be capable of asking these questions? Okay, we seem to be in this whole discussion, we seem to be keeping the human being out of discussion. I would like to come back again and again that linguistics is needed not for NLP, for NLP researcher. Okay.
So I want to throw in another idea, but then Vasu is telling me better close.
Yeah.
If you look at sciences, particularly physics, chemistry, how they developed, what is the scientific method? And what does doing science mean? And based on that, you build technology, of course. It was very clear that science is not just about observation. The philosophers of science told us that no, science is not just about observation, that you are observing and you see something. No. That you need a hypothesis before you can see anything.
Right.
And that hypothesis tells you what you are looking for. And then you do experiments or you observe keeping that hypothesis in mind. And after that, you decide whether the hypothesis is to be accepted or rejected. What do you think is the role, or maybe this question I can leave this audience with, that there is this role of theorizing and hypothesizing for doing any scientific work, which is now well accepted. And now when you do this, and hypotheses which pass, which go through, they become theories, and then we use those theories. Now, sometimes those theories are opposed to every single known data point. I think back about Newton. Newton gave something counterintuitive when he talked of laws of motion. So he said, all moving bodies will move forever. I'm paraphrasing him, for moving bodies. For static bodies, they will stay stationary forever. Right? Idea of inertia I'm bringing in. Right? But if you think the implication of that idea, all moving bodies will move forever, and it violates every single experience of every single human being on earth. Now he came up with a theory which violated every single data point. So if you had data science, you never have this laws of motion saying that law of inertia holds. Impossible. So people asked Newton, what do you mean? You're talking nonsense. He said, they stop because there is a counter force. So what is that counter force? He said, usually it is friction, but there could be other methods. So before we can make sense of data, and more importantly, if we have systems that are learning automatically from data, we have to be aware of what the hypotheses or known theories are. And then we can use them and go beyond. And we come up with new theories where we will use these tools. So this marriage between theory and data, this I believe is very important. And it comes up in structures, it comes up in domain knowledge, it comes up in discourse, semantics, pragmatics, and so on. And ultimately, multimodality. So I thought I'll make that statement and then maybe leave, because Vasu will not leave me otherwise. But if anyone has a very compelling point in 30 seconds, kindly do make it. Joseph wants to say something. I can
No,
see.
I mean, it's a joke, and the joke is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there often is. So.
Okay. So we will close at this. Thank you. Thank you all the panelists.